Hey everybody, sorry we had a little bit of confusion about figuring this out. We seem to have got it now.
Mm.
Um, Happy Easter Sunday, I guess it is, right?
Yeah, yeah, if you for all of you who celebrate Easter, happy Easter. Yeah.
And Passover, I guess also.
Yeah, it's,
Um, I guess
in the
the
past.
good news is that people were very worried that Trump was going to announce some kind of like martial law thing this weekend, and so far it doesn't look like that's happening. I guess there was January 20th. They said there was going to be a 90-day period to decide if the southern border was an emergency.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe it's still early in the day, so it still could happen. I should knock on wood. But apparently, if he doesn't do it today, then he loses some of his special, privileges or whatever. Who the fuck knows at this point? But
Yeah.
yeah, but I appreciated you reaching out to me, Starhawk, about one of my recent pieces.
Mhm.
And we started a little bit of an email discussion around how, what's happening and how, like, people we know, like Charles Eisenstein, who we thought were, like, I don't know, sane and soulful people, have kind of like migrated over to, you know, cuckoo land.
Mhm.
And yeah, it feels like just we're in a very different situation than we were, 5, 10 years ago. And I thought I would love to get your wise perspective on what you're seeing and what you're feeling and all that stuff. So I was excited that you reached out. you know.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, just this weekend, I found myself starting to feel hopeful. The sort of basic underlying level of, uh, gloom and dread, like, suddenly shifted. I think partly because we're seeing enough opposition to Trump that it's slowing him down. And also, I mean, those guys are just this incredible combination of like cruelty and ineptness at the same time. So they keep making some big mistakes. And I think it honestly has to do with the lack of empathy. That empathy, it's not just feeling compassion for people or feeling sorry for people or caring about people. It's actually a form of intelligence. Like it's being able to see the world through somebody else's perspective. And if you can't do that, then you can't really imagine how your actions are going to land with other people. And I think they really think, like Elon Musk really thinks, putting on a cheese head and going to Wisconsin and throwing $1 million checks around is going to make everybody like him. And it's a surprise to them that they're pissing everybody off. But they've now committed the greatest sin ever, which is hurting well off people in their pocketbooks. And I think they're starting to see the reaction to that. The tragedy is I'm not sure how much, so many important things are being destroyed, so many people's lives are being destroyed. The damage that they're doing on the way is going to be very, very hard to recover from.
Right. I mean, and it's kind of ironic if you're coming from a more leftist perspective, because, yeah, there were many things that were very aggravating and frustrating around kind of like the system. And it
Mhm.
did kind of seem bloated. And, it did kind of seem like, our aid organizations were actually like CIA fronts in many cases. And so they've sort of taken a lot of, points that the left would be kind of like behind, but they've now kind of like torqued them around, twirled them around, so they support this like far right wing, reactionary kind of initiative. Um,
Yeah, it's great.
and similarly with similar was go ahead.
Oh, just this kind of very odd turnaround where suddenly we're having to defend institutions we've been protesting against, for decades, right? And yet, uh, it's kind of like, well, if they fall at this point, we're not going to get the beautiful, decentralized, more democratic, more fair, more just society we've always been envisioning and working for. We're probably going to get something that's even more authoritarian. So I think it's a wake up call, both, to protest the right and also to look and say, well, where have we on the left? Um, like obviously what we've done has not worked. We have not built a strong enough, broad enough, progressive enough coalition to fight these guys effectively. Well, we can fight them, but to have prevented this takeover and to have channeled into some of the frustrations that underlie it. And I think we can. I think we could. That's what I've been writing about and working towards. But I think we also have to do a little bit of soul searching along the way. We can't just do what we've.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, a little bit of soul searching, but on the other hand, in some ways, we've also just, like those of us who call ourselves like leftists. I mean, that term is kind of problematic, the sort of
Mm,
like dual dichotomy between left and right. But because, in the 60s and 70s, there was an effort, a lot of people wanted to build a left in America, and simply they weren't allowed to do that because, you had leaders who were assassinated on the left, whether it was like, what was the Black Panther guy? Fred Hampton or whatever. Or people were put into jail on trumped up drug charges, so that a lot of the movement's energy and finances went into trying to like rescue these leaders and so on. And you had innocent protesters shot at Kent State and so on. So and I guess in a way, yeah, America's always been the kind of iron fist in a velvet glove, and
mhm.
now there's no more velvet glove. It's just iron fist. You know. So yeah, so we weren't allowed to have a leftist movement, an organic left, and also the two-party system, made that functionally impossible. And then you had, the rise of Reagan. Jimmy Carter was probably the last like, sane policymaking president in terms of, recognizing the energy crisis and the need for conservation and so on. And then, but nobody was ready yet to give up on the idea of like endless growth and, endless wealth and so on. So then you had trickle down economics. And then the Democrats realized their only survival strategy was to basically imitate the right. So, a lot of the problems that we have now are Clinton was really quite responsible for them. Like the Telecommunications Act of '96, which allowed for media monopolization and also gave sort of tech platforms the kind of right to. So all this stuff was kind of like, yeah, like the right moved further right and the Democrats moved further right. Um, and so I don't think we can beat ourselves up too much because also the amount of money on the side of the right has just, always been quite huge. And now it's just gargantuan. I mean, now it just really feels like, and in terms of media control, the right has also gone past the sort of progressive middle of the road establishment in terms of building these media networks and also creating their own sort of infrastructure of influencers. Um, yeah, so I don't really know what we can do at this point. But yeah, I mean, in a way, it feels like a fire. Maybe like a forest fire is like the right metaphor. That sometimes the fire just has to burn itself out, and then whatever like seeds are left are going to sprout after it. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I guess the analogy I've been thinking of is like America's like a sort of gigantic, 18-ton truck, and uh, that needs a lot of like repair, and uh, a lot of things weren't really working very well in it. Um, but we decided to put somebody in the driver's seat who's like a kind of mean, nasty 5-year-old with no sense of control who's rapidly driving the whole thing off a cliff. And, I'm not sure how far to carry this analogy, but it's like, do we eject him, get somebody back has some sense, and then say, well, what do we need to do to repair the truck? Uh, we replace that smoky old diesel engine with an electric engine, or do we need to rebuild start all over again with a whole new? And I'm not, I tend to be a renovator rather than a tear it down, start anew person when it comes to things like buildings. And, I'm the one who'll like keep nurturing you know, that broccoli and cutting it down, letting it resprout and cutting it down, letting it resprout. Um, but politically, I've always was more of the we need to start all over again. However, at this point, I'm not so sure about that. I think I don't know that we're in a point where starting all over again. Um, if we're going to do that, or even if we're going to say, well, how do we repair this damn? Um, we've got to actually have a vision of what we want and have a strategy for getting there. So I think that's what we've seen in recent years. We've had some incredible revolutions, like the Egyptian revolution, where people threw out a dictator that'd been there for 45 years and did it not violently, but they didn't have a plan to take power and consolidate power. I mean, I know some of the organizers, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to transform power and create democratic power. But what happened was people who weren't hesitant about taking power grabbed it, and now they have a new form of autocracy that's perhaps even worse than the old form. So I think we have to be clear about what kind of system we want and how we're going to get there. And it's hard to do that when we're just overwhelmed by kind of going like, this thing is heading to the cliff. It's going to smash. How are we going to survive? Um, but I also think this is the time to do and to think about that, because once the smash happens, right, um, we've got to be prepared to figure out what we're going to do with all those pieces and to do it quickly and not start the thinking then. Yeah, somebody just said in the chat
Yeah, I totally agree.
when it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I totally agree with that. I mean, I did personally try to create like a long range model. I wrote a book called "How Soon Is Now," which took me like 10 years. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess one little area maybe I would push back a little bit. Like, I'm, I'm not sure that what Trump is doing is as senseless and immature. I mean, it's terrible, and yeah, they are very brutal and adolescent. But I do think there might be more of a plan in kind of even like these tariffs that he's doing, which now nobody in business can trust if they can build a factory anywhere, because they don't know if he's going to raise the tariffs or lower the tariffs. It's like an effort to break the middle class,
Mhm.
even the upper middle class. So you more completely centralize wealth and power among a very small group, and that group. So if the US, for instance, goes bankrupt, or if all these companies go bankrupt, people like Peter Thiel and Musk will be able to just buy up whatever they want, like companies. And then if the US is forced to, default on its loans or whatever, then public lands like Yosemite, could be sold off to like the Saudi wealth fund. And I've been looking a lot at the ideology behind the tech oligarchs, which is like people like Balaji Srinivasan and Curtis Yarvin, and this book the sovereign individual. So it's kind of ironic because they're now pretending they love America and they care about America, but actually their ideology is that the nation state is finished and that the future is what they talk about as like commercialized sovereignty.
Mhm.
So it'll be like, and Trump announced these like freedom cities. So these will be like serfdoms where they have a corporate ruler or an oligarch that will be setting the rules. There won't really be the rule of law, but you can see they're just eager to discard the Constitution and the rule of law. And that's yeah, it's and then they also think, unfortunately, it may seem totally like they're doing this in an inept way, but they're just being very fast because they think that they have to kind of go as fast as possible and before a meaningful resistance or forms, which maybe we're now starting to begin to see with the Harvard and even the courts and so on. But they're trying to push as fast as they can in this direction before they encounter significant resistance. Um, yeah, and because I think a lot of them are seeing a future where the environment breaks down. I mean, they're pretending they don't believe in climate change, but of course they know that's happening, and they see LA and North Carolina and so on. So that's why they want to grab Greenland and Canada because they see that those are going to be where populations will be moving. That's where the money is going to go. That's where it's going to become more possible to live as the South becomes too warm for many people or has too many natural disasters. And also, they want those resources for artificial superintelligence with the idea that they can actually have breakthroughs in biology that allow them to live forever. So I think there is like more of a plan underway that people like Curtis Yarvin have actually kind of spelled out. If you read the book The Sovereign Individual, you get a deep sense that there's like a construct that they're following, that it's not as chaotic as it seems. Um, I
I
guess I
do
wanted to ask you also. So we talked about how certain. Well, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I do agree with you
Go ahead.
that they do have a plan, and I have read some of that stuff about Yarvin and that, their kind of horrific vision for the world. I just think that because of their lack of empathy, because of their inability to see the world through other people's eyes and understand how this is landing with people, they may be underestimating the kind of resistance that they are generating by doing it so fast and uh, so blatantly and brutally. I think they could do the same exact thing if they did it slowly and subtly, and we really would have no chance of resisting it. Um, so, uh, anyway, that's kind of where I feel there's some cracks in the system, let's say. And I do think that's there.
Totally. And I guess
I do think that's the agenda of the techno bros. Although, really, like, it's ironic because as bad as the system is for so many people, if there's anyone that it was really working well for, it's like Musk and Teal and all those guys. Um, I think
but by the way, I see that Penny Livingston joined it.
Oh, hi, Penny. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and she had a great comment. She wrote, "This may sound strange, but I'm curious about the military. Their first oath is to protect the Constitution.
Uh-huh.
What about starting there, as it could bring the most conservative people on board?" Thoughts? I think that's a very profound uh,
Mm,
possibility or comment. And yeah, I mean, essentially, like if you go to Curtis Yarvin's philosophy, it's about it's the control of the military is basically what it comes down to.
mm,
And if they're in a position where they can, because obviously we have this massive lethal force. if they have a stranglehold on that, it's extremely difficult to imagine resistance. But if the military, yeah, it doesn't really support this anti-constitutional
Mm.
scenario, then maybe something else can happen. But of course, that's also very terrifying, because then you end up in kind of, you could easily end up in a kind of civil war situation, where this country does have all these like nuclear weapons sitting around and all this other stuff. So I don't know. It's an intense, very intense threshold we're in. And they've also seemed like, to Starhawk's point about how fast they're going, like they seem to want to precipitate this constitutional crisis and almost bring it to a point of civil unrest or civil conflict, intentionally. you
Yeah. Um, and I
know.
do know one of my old organizing buddies is really focused on how do we organize the military and let people in the military know that they actually have not just the right, but the responsibility to refuse unconstitutional orders. Uh, I think that's a really important place to focus because of that. And that is where revolutions succeed, is when the military, hey, we're not going to do the work of the autocrats anymore. And for most of the people in the military, um, you know, have no vested interest in uh, a world of freedom, cities, and oligarch, rulers. Um,
Yeah.
and in the Fifth Sacred Thing, the novel I wrote years ago, the futuristic novel, where it really centers around the question of how do you resist violence without becoming what you're fighting against. And in the end, the way they win is by turning the soldiers against each other and recruiting them and bringing them in.
I also wanted to ask you. So we talked about how it's been interesting to see the neo-reactionary or far right Trump regime kind of co-opt certain issues that matter to the left,
Hmm.
in a way that has kind of made it very confusing. Like the sense that the intelligence agencies were actually working through our aid organizations and so on. A lot of people I know on the left felt kind of a satisfaction in a way when USAID was dismantled, because they were aware of its propagandistic uses for the American empire and so on. But another aspect of this has been the RFK Jr. kind of like Maha movement, and how
Hmm.
many people that I know, and I'm sure you know, from like the transformational culture, the Burning Man world, the kind of like yoga world, ended up kind of like making got sort of converted into this RFK thing, and are kind of like many people feel that we are getting too many vaccines and that it is causing negative health effects, and they're excited because RFK has promised to focus on like organic food, and kind of like examine whether pharmaceuticals are beneficial for us, or get rid of sort of psychopharmacological drugs that a lot of people have a lot of suspicion about, including me. I feel they're way overprescribed and overused. So I'm wondering how you think about all of that and what you've seen in your communities and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I come from the world of um, paganism and witchcraft, which is, you know, deeply tied into herbalism and all of that stuff for years and years and centuries, and from permaculture, where we're very much involved in, regenerative land use and organic farming. And it's alarming, because what RFK has done is he's a kind of a mix of things. Some of his things are good ideas. They're things we've been talking about forever, like we should get chemicals out of the food supply. But he mixes it in with this complete abandonment of some of the stuff in science which is valid and good and important, like actually having evidence and actually doing the research and doing your best to do it in an unbiased way. A couple years ago, I was at a conference and I heard Josh Fatal speak. Josh was one of those three American hikers who were hiking around the Iranian border and got caught and accused of being spies and were imprisoned for a couple of years in Iran. And he talked about being there in prison and listening to the propaganda and realizing that propaganda is always a mixture of truth and lies. It always starts with something that's true. So you start by saying, chemicals in your food are bad for you. And we all go, yeah, and we need to deal with those pesticides. And we all go, yeah. And, the big pharma making huge profits off the COVID vaccine. We all go, yeah. But that doesn't mean the COVID vaccine doesn't work and that it isn't effective and that it isn't a good choice to actually take it if you have the opportunity to, or that it's injecting you with, I don't know what, microchips that are feeding information to somebody. So I think on the left in the natural foods and health world, like we can't abandon evidence and actual truth. And we need to understand that truth is not always easy to figure out. And then it is often nuanced. It's not always, it generally never is either or one thing completely or another thing. And that when we also have to be guided by a kind of moral compass, I think, that um, is true in the New Age movement and in any movement, that when you lose touch with some really core values like compassion and justice, um, then you're going to go off the rails. And it doesn't matter how much you disguise it in New Age jargon or talk about, not being judgmental or whatever. You end up supporting, like Eisenstein, some really, really vile and awful stuff. Um, but my fear is that RFK is going to delegitimize all of our legitimate concerns about chemicals in the food supply and chemical farming and all of those things. So, um, I've had questions about vaccinations. So many friends who didn't vaccinate their kids. But ultimately, when it came to COVID, I kind of went, hey, I'm in my 70s, right? I have asthma. I am not exactly like slender. I have all the things that are going to make this thing deadly for me. And if I can get a vaccine that'll keep me from getting it, I should be grateful and thankful. And um, I probably got like more vitriol for posting that I got a vaccine than for anything I've ever written about Palestine or witchcraft or supporting Hillary Clinton, which also pissed a lot of people off. But I felt it was important to say, yeah, we got to not throw away our common sense and not throw away like our basic human decency.
Yeah. As you said, I think it was a very complex and nuanced issue that we didn't really weren't able to deal with very well. I mean, Bill Gates had gamified out. He'd had these series of conferences with sort of WHO and infectious disease organizations. Like, what happens if there's a virus like this, and how do you control information and so on? So they kind of use this very wooden kind of like and people felt like they were being condescended to, and when they had to make a personal decision. And then
Yeah.
it's probably also true that the vaccines. Well, we know the vaccines. At first they were like, these are 100% effective against COVID. Then they were like, these are 90% effective, and they were like, these are 70% effective, and these are like 30%. They kept changing the goalposts. And meanwhile, we now also know that it was almost highly likely to certain that it was a lab leak. Like it was a laboratory created kind of hybrid, and the government refused to admit that, and so on. So they created a huge amount of kind of collective negativity or mistrust. And then it may be the case with the vaccines that they were excellent for people in their elder years, like my mother and so on, but maybe not so good for healthy people in their 20s and 30s, who were probably going to be able to fight off the illness, and some of them maybe developed heart issues or whatever. So there was not really yeah a way of addressing that societally. And it's kind of amazing. I feel like something really changed with COVID. Like maybe it was really, I mean, it almost feels like a shift in consciousness kind of towards a more confused situation. And but I'm kind of curious, since we mentioned him. Both of us had relationships with Charles Eisenstein. I published and edited one of his books, Sacred Economics. And really, when I had my web magazine years ago, I gave him like what was a really, kind of like a big platform. And he was writing a lot of the stuff that I also wanted to say, and I did say, but I was focused on building the sort of network and the platform. So I was like, okay, I thought he could really be the star, kind of speaker of this whole new movement. And in retrospect, boy, do I regret that, because over time I became more and more, less and less impressed with his perspective. And then finally, he just lost his way. But now I just find him to be such a destructive and negative, kind of force. Uh, with his fairly large following, and just kind of like ambivalence around Trump. And basically really, like, this guy Dave Dellinger has been writing some great pieces about him, that basically he only kind of like sort of strawmans Trump, and not the sort of anti-Trump perspective. He really doesn't. He's really basically supporting this right-wing movement with the sort of pretense of moral objectivity or ambivalence or whatever. So I'm curious if you have any insight into what happened to him, and maybe some other people in our sort of shared anarcho, kind of anti-capitalist, spiritual culture, who ended up kind of veering off in this weird direction, and how that happened.
I don't know him well personally, not nearly as well as you do. I maybe met him actually once. I've known his ideas and interacted with him, and for a while there thought, he was writing beautifully about broader possibilities and shifts in consciousness and things that I agree with. But I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been writing this book kind of chapter by chapter on Substack called The Movement We Need, and thinking about what are some of our core human needs that we haven't addressed very well on the left, just using that term loosely for convenience. And I think they have been addressed on the right in very negative ways, but in ways that are in some ways easier to do, like our need for belonging, for feeling we're part of something larger than ourselves. I think it's a really huge, human drive. And the right wing says, okay, you belong. If you're white, you're good. You belong, you have value, which is another one of our needs. Um, you can feel that you have agency and power by identifying with this very powerful person and this powerful movement. And you get conspiracy theories like QAnon that create a sense of meaning and purpose. And the left, like, we have attempted to say we're trying to create a world where everyone belongs. It doesn't matter whether your color or your race or whatever. But in effect, we spend a lot of time telling people, oh, you said that wrong and you're wrong for that. And correcting each other's language on the internet and making people feel like if they make a misstep, they're going to be ejected from the movement, which makes people feel unsafe and feel powerless. Um, and, we have a bigger challenge as a movement to create a sense of power and empowerment because we're up against such huge, powerful systems. But I think people need to feel that, we need to feel a sense of safety. We need to feel a sense of belonging. We need to feel a sense of that we're valued, that we can make a contribution, that we have some agency, and we need some framework that gives meaning and purpose to the world and to us. And I think if we can recognize that, we actually have the opportunity right now to build a much broader and stronger and more powerful movement. And I think some of that ethic has to challenge this idea of individual sovereignty. That uh, if there is an ethic that comes from permaculture, that comes from understanding of uh, what I've been talking about for decades, of the idea of the sacred being embodied, being inherent in humans in the natural world. It's an ethic of interdependence and interconnection and relationship. And um, that means, again, like with COVID, that there's a tension between your individual sovereignty and your responsibility to community and to others. So maybe, yeah, if you're a healthy 23-year-old, the vaccine might not necessarily be the best for you. And I do know people who have had bad immune reactions afterwards and gotten sick from it. But you might also have a responsibility to not infect other people around you who might be more vulnerable. And again, we need to just recognize that's not always a simple either or, right, wrong, black, white thing. It is a kind of nuanced tension, but that tension has to come back again, like the compass swinging to north to saying, you know, we are interrelated, we are interdependent, we have a responsibility to one another. And that part of our value as human beings is how we fulfill that responsibility.
And in terms of Charles's work, you feel that that was he got a little bit too caught up in the personal sovereignty kind of idea, or how does that relate?
Yeah, both the personal sovereignty, I mean, I see that not just in him, but in a lot of people altogether, but also in sort of in this idea that uh, you know, we are beyond duality. There's it's not right or wrong that we must accept everybody. And I think it misses sort of this is kind of the common sense that, in a sense, yeah, we are beyond duality and everyone has a sacred spark and we should be open to everybody. But that doesn't mean we have to abandon our judgment about people's behavior and choices and the impact of those choices. So, I'm sure that Donald Trump has within him a spark of the divine. Uh, yeah, is some strange aspect of the goddess, but that doesn't mean I have to say all of his behavior is good and that I can't say him in a way that is cruel and destructive. And the most compassionate thing might be to stop him. You know,
Um,
I'm gonna be
I w-
listening. I gotta go grab. I gotta plug in my phone quickly before it dies. So,
okay.
but
Yeah,
you
yeah.
keep
Go
talking.
for it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Um, okay. Um, what was my point? Um, by the way, there have been many wonderful comments in the comment section, and it's also nice to see that people seem to agree about kind of like this RFK situation, and some other perspectives. It's very nice to hear. Um, hmm. Oh, I guess what I was wanting to think about, you mentioned how the left became too focused on this kind of like ideological purity, um, around like canceling people and so on.
Yeah,
And now in retrospect, that really looks like a total disaster. Um, and among the people who got canceled, there was like this Me Too movement, and a lot of the men who were cast aside or thrown out of their careers were men who were more on the left, like liberals, and so on. And that sort of led to the situation where you only have like you have most of the very powerful kind of like manosphere voices now, or all these like right wing men. Um, and I think in a way, particularly for white men, let's say, it began to look like a worse and worse bargain, the sort of progressive culture, in that you're kind of saying your sexuality is not good. You've inherited all this privilege, so you don't need to get your art, at the Whitney Biennial. It's only going to be artists who are, gay or Native American or whatever. You don't need to get your books published right now. You have to be accept the guilt for these generations, even if you didn't really do anything necessarily for it. And also like, you have to be, walk on eggshells around women because they're very sensitive and are easily victimized and so on. So unfortunately, I think that this ideological purity kind of like construct on the left, which developed through the academy and so on over the last like 20, 30 years, or maybe factor to this right-wing hellscape that we've plunged into. And I still don't, I mean, it's nice to say interdependence, of course, and we agree with that, but what's like if you're like let's say you're a 25-year-old, all sorts of people, but 25-year-old white man who wants to, have a great career or like do something big in the world, what are you going to look at? You're not going to look at going back to the land in rural Appalachia and building a permaculture farm. You're gonna be like, okay, I could be like a crypto trader, I could be an AI programmer, and by joining the sort of right wing, that's going to be my avenue to like wealth and power. Um, so I mean, that's why yeah, I'm just curious, like, if you this book and what would be the new movement. What's the better life that you're offering and contribute to the earth in a way? That's kind of, I feel like, part of the problem right now.
well, I think that we have to see a movement as an ecosystem, and an ecosystem has multiple niches in it. Niches for all kinds of different identities, different capacities, different orientations, and that it's not a zero sum game. That our value as human beings, it's not limited. If I say women have value, it doesn't mean men don't. Or we say people of color now, we want to value and center their experiences and in some ways redress some of the imbalance. That doesn't mean that there's no room for white men. There's a lot of things that white men can do and will do and should do, and probably can do better than anyone else, one of which is talk to other white men. Um, and, I have often felt, I mean, I've been a feminist since back in the early 70s when I first wandered into the Women's Center in Venice. And they were. They were choosing new directors in truly like egalitarian, anti-authoritarian fashion by having everyone throw their name in a hat and pulling out the names of the new directors. And I ended up after my first meeting as one of the directors of the Women's Center. Uh, but uh, I've also often felt that. Um, we wanted to redress this situation where women who were victims of rape and abuse and harassment were totally discounted and not believed and often um, attacked for bringing forth the truth of what they said. And so we say, believe victims. Right? But I actually think in this moment, what we need to do is say we need to give victims a fair hearing and support victims. Um, but we can't be less fair than the criminal justice system. We can't condemn people without a fair hearing. And even if somebody does something, we need to offer them a path back. Somebody who, uh, I'm not necessarily talking about someone who's dyed in the wool misogynist unless they actually change, but someone like Al Franken who has this history of supporting women and women's rights, and probably did some stupid shit when he was on Saturday Night Live. Um, you know, why couldn't there be a path back for him to regain respect and regain his um, standing? And, you know, uh, I do think some of this goes back to a culture that devalues not just women, but the set of qualities that have been assigned to women. Those qualities of caring for others, nurturing, of really stewarding the next generations, of responsibility, and has assigned to men all these qualities of aggression and innovation and protection. uh, And, the feminist movement was about saying, hey, right, these qualities are not actually distributed by gender or by the shape of your genitalia. They are human qualities. We all have them and we all need to have them. Um, and the later form of this has been about people kind of rejecting the idea of gender altogether and saying, well, who's to say what's a woman and what's a man? Um, but ultimately, what I feel like we need to do is to revalue those qualities of caring and nurturing. And, I know so many young men now who are beautiful fathers in a way that nobody was when I was a child. I think of one of my neighbors, I always have this vision of him carrying his little baby son in a backpack and a chainsaw under his arm, going out to do forestry work. You know, the qualities we associate with masculinity can also be associated with nurturing and caring and taking care of earth, taking care of nature, taking care of the planet, and that's where people can find a sense of value and of agency that doesn't have to be based on uh, I can control others. I am more powerful than others. I can, you know, bully and disparage someone else in order to elevate my value. And I think if we do that for men, you know, I think men are hurting, young men are hurting. Um, but I think that's also because they're being offered these terrible and false solutions to their lives that are not going to make them happier. You know, I always tell
Sure.
you know, if you really want to be attractive to women, you know, if you really want to have girlfriends, if you really want someone to fall in love with you, if you really want to have like great sex, you know, the kind of sex that even if you're an atheist, it makes you want to believe in some God that you can thank for making people capable of experiencing this. It's actually really easy. All you have to do is just pay respectful attention to the women in your life and the non binary people in your life. Listen to them, focus on them, take them seriously. Believe me, right? You will find somebody who will think you're the most marvelous person in the world because that is so rare. Um, you know, but if you try to control other people, um, either physically with violence or bullying them on the internet or all of that kind of masculine stuff, you know, you're going to end up alone in your basement, just whacking off by yourself because you're not going to be attractive to them. And you don't have to have a six pack and you don't have to be like, you know, muscular and strong or slim or anything. Believe me, I know men that are, you know, small and funny looking and whatever that somebody is going to think is the most adorable person in the world if you only learn to actually treat other people with respect and meet them face on. Uh, and I think ultimately it goes back to a culture that is profoundly suspicious of sex pleasure in general. You know, it's the sort of Puritan and um, anti sex stuff that's built into Western culture for thousands of years. You know, if we lived in a culture that really thought sex was a good thing, then we'd be in a very different place right now.
I'm noticing that I'm having a response to stuff that you're saying in terms of like you're using the word we a lot. And
Uh-huh.
that's also been one of my big problems is like I don't know how we create a we, you know,
Mm,
at this point. Like the right wing seems to have a we going on. But on the progressive and the left side, um, you know, because we could say like, yeah, we would like to address people who make mistakes in some way that's not just casting them out, but what's the we, you know, that does that? Like where is that we? Like how does one, yeah, it doesn't really feel like we have a unified collective anything. And so people end up just in these kind of alienated, atomized kind of scenarios
hmm I think we need to.
where the power of social media also means that. Mhm. Go ahead.
Oh, I think
Oops,
we
go
need
ahead.
a we that's a very big we right now. That's a we that is everybody who is standing up for justice in whatever way uh, that they can. And that has to include, of course, you know, the people who have historically been targeted and oppressed, the people who are currently being targeted and oppressed. But it also has to include people who've historically been privileged, but who are willing to say, hey, right, uh, I
I
am
I
this.
I I I understand what you mean, but I'm more asking like how do we actually constitute that we, the we the people. Whereas at the moment, like like if we were all part of some organization, or we had, what I mean, it's like where's the we right now? Because I don't see it.
I think it was Peter Brooks, like this very conservative columnist, just put out something saying like we need like some unified anti-fascist organization, uh, to fight this right now. It was kind of astounding that someone from his political perspective is standing up and saying this. And I don't know if we'll
Oh,
get
David Brooks, you're talking
David
about
Brooks.
from the Times. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll get I don't know if we'll get a centralized organization or, a great leader. I don't know if we'll get like the next Martin Luther King, but I do think that we can create something that has a sense of a unified set of goals and ideals that we can all feel part of. And there are many, many ways to create that sense of belonging. There's an institute at UC Berkeley called the Othering and Belonging Institute, where they do a lot of work and research and a lot of good writing about this. How do we create a sense of belonging that doesn't depend on saying we belong because that other group doesn't belong? And one of the ways you do it is by encouraging people to actually talk about their core values and share their core values and speaking about those deep questions of value, um, which, we haven't always done on the left. Sometimes we do, but I think we could do more of it in our groups and our organizations. And I think when we do that, we'll find that there are common values we hold that do transcend those categories of left and right, and that allow us to ally together, um, and create that sense of we.
I remember years ago there was an attempt to create like this Declaration of Interdependence.
Mm,
Maybe it's something like that.
yeah.
Um, Yeah, the David Brooks thing was kind of interesting. I mean, not to belabor it, but I just wrote a piece about that. I mean, yeah, he's somebody through his whole career was a conservative. Went to the Hoover Institution. He was a fellow at Hoover Institution, which is a libertarian think tank. And he's argued against the raising the minimum wage for decades. He argued against raising the taxes on the wealthy. He argued against football players, high school football players bending the knee in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. So his whole career has been for wealthy people, against collective solidarity. And now they're coming for him
Hmm.
because if this Trump thing goes on, like he's been an anti-Trumper from the beginning, they're lining up to go after, everybody in the establishment who, ever said a negative thing about Trump. And with AI, they're going to be able to do that, find all those people and all that stuff. So now he's quaking in his boots. And now finally he's like, oh, like, we need a movement. I'm not a movement guy, but we need a movement of collective, solidarity and civil disobedience. I mean, now that we have, but so these people who are actually have been incredibly responsible, and the wealth inequality and the kind of mistreatment of the working class people, that is what led to Trumpism. So yeah, so it was kind of, I felt a little bit of Schadenfreude, I
Yeah.
think is the right word, on reading his column. Well, of course, it's not good for anybody that these guys are ending the rule of law in this society
Yeah.
and just coming after people with retribution. Um, one model that's always intrigued me. I don't know. Do you know this guy, Christopher? By the way, we're really getting wonderful stream of amazing comments. So I really appreciate all that stuff in the. But a book that I really loved, which maybe for me is what I think is most likely. Strangely enough, is this book by this guy Christopher Bach? Do you know him?
No.
Bache. He he wrote a book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe.
Hmm.
And he did a lot of high dose LSD with his wife, kind of guiding him. He was a professor, and he had this. He kind of beamed into this sort of prophetic forecast of what's going to happen in the next decades, and it was kind of like a lot of destruction, a lot of collapse. But then I think you'll like this part, like sort of new communities that are more authentic and how they're relating and how they're dealing with the earth, sort of rising up, and then those communities forming these kind of like a new, more like earth-based culture
Hmm.
that's kind of like reckoned with the ravages of post-industrial civilization kind of emerging, and I mean that would that would be a nice kind of like outcome. I don't know if from where you wrote the fifth sacred thing to where we are now, how are you seeing kind of like where we might go from here, and I know you said in the beginning that you're feeling more optimistic because you're seeing more spirit of kind of like rising up in the people.
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote the fifth sacred thing like in the late 80s and early 90s. Um, and uh, it's kind of alarming, like how clearly all the bad parts of it seem to be manifesting. Um, and the good parts of it, I think, are harder. In the book, it's set in the Bay Area, and the idea is that the country has fallen apart. Interestingly enough, the date for that happening was 2028 in the book, which is like alarmingly like both close and more plausible every day with what's happening. But that in the Bay Area, they resisted the takeover from the authoritarian forces, and they've built this multiracial, multicultural, nature-based society that's extremely democratic, and where there's streets, and everybody's growing food, and uh, all the different religions and cultures and languages are all valued and celebrated, and it's a diverse and a beautiful place. Uh, but then in the story, the question is, what happens when the Southlands, who've turned into a kind of techno feudalistic society, what happens when they invade the North, and how do they resist? And um, that was my overriding question at that time, because we were doing a lot of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience around what was going on in Central America and around the forests, and various kinds of U.S. intervention and around nuclear weapons, and was really questioning, this is fine to do in the U.S. where we're suffering relatively, um, the consequences are sometimes really hard, but they're not like being dropped out of helicopters or blowtorches in the armpits. But what do you do when you're really facing unrelenting violence? Can nonviolence work? Um, and I wrote a sequel to it, about 10 years ago, called City of Refuge, um, where the question was really different. It was much more inspired by what I saw during Occupy. It was a question of, how do we build the new world when people are so damaged by the old? And uh, part of what I was saying in that book is we have to develop some of those structures if we want a world where people are going to be more directly democratic. We have to teach people how to make decisions together and how to actually get along and work together. Because the biggest constraint in all of our movements, and in the permaculture movement as well, It's never, we always say it's permaculture systems don't fail because the gray water system goes wrong. They fail because um, of conflict in the group or the organization. No uh, eco village ever collapsed just because they had a bad gardening season. They collapse because people get in conflict. So that's why I've been doing a lot of work on what we started to call social permaculture, which is really how do we design and develop human systems? How do we really think about our groups and organizations so that they meet our needs as human beings in positive ways, in ways that actually further justice and equity and diversity and that balance of individual freedom and interdependence and interrelationship. And I think if we can, we have to do a lot of that work, as vital as it is right now to stand up and protest all the stuff that's going wrong. It's also important to continue that work of developing the skills and the tools and the sets of ideas we need for that new world so that we have them ready to put into place whenever we have the opportunity, and that we can do it skillfully. We can do it without as much failure and damage as we often see along the way. Uh,
Mm.
so I'm kind of rambling on there, but
Thank you. Beautiful. Yeah. So I think, if you don't mind, I think it's maybe time to wrap up for today. I want to go out and catch a little of the afternoon sunlight.
yeah,
But I really appreciate hearing your perspective and meeting you again. And I hope people will join your newsletter and follow your work as you think about this whole question of social permaculture and building in this sort of perilous time. Also, people, I hope they will follow also my Substack if they don't already.
yeah,
And yeah, we had a long hour-ish conversation. We had 543 people peer in or stay with us to
yeah,
some
that's
extent,
great.
and we got a lot of amazing comments. So this is really, I think Substack Live is a very wonderful platform, right? People who really follow. Maybe we can do this again. I'm not sure if you can do three people on a Substack Live. If you can, I think that could also be very interesting
Hmm.
to experiment with. But we'll look into that.
Yeah,
Thank you everybody for joining. It was great to have you here. Thank you so much, Starhawk. Feel free to say any last words that you got.
thank you for setting this up and making this happen, Daniel. It's been great. It's great to connect with you again and have such an interesting discussion. And yeah, people can find me at starhawk.substack.com and be great if you subscribe. I should also say we're going to be doing a fundraiser on the 21st, which I guess is tomorrow, for Earth Activist Training, which is our permaculture organization. And we give diversity scholarships for people of color and indigenous folks. And we are also offering scholarships for online courses now to any federal workers that have been displaced and been fired. And we're going to have a ritual and a presentation. You can hear some of the wonderful work some of our students are doing and some wonderful ideas about strategy and also a little earth healing ritual. So that's tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And go to earthactivisttraining.org and you can get the details on that. And thank you. And
Fantastic. Thanks everybody. We'll see you again soon, I hope.
mhm, bye.
Ciao, ciao.